live in a period of widespread discontent with current governments and their policies about pretty much everything. We also live in a period of advanced and sophisticated critique of these policies and of abundant alternatives to the policies that we have now. The mystery is then why so little has opened up in political systems over the past 30 years, in spite of the anti-globalization movement kicked off in Seattle in 1999, the Occupy protests that followed the financial crisis 10 years later, and the global Black Lives Matter mobilization prompted by the police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others 10 years after that. Whether the setting is Brazil, Hong Kong, France, South Africa, Egypt, the US, or the UK, the critiques and the demands for change that emerge in mass mobilizations are not treated by these very different governments as valued sources of democratic intelligence on which democratic governments are obliged to draw. Instead, governments, whether authoritarian or elaborately democratic, treat crowds and protests as problems of public order, which they can wait out, ignore, divert, or suppress. Elaine Ruelwal's book explains to us how this police sovereignty got so deeply rooted in Western theory and practice of government, and also how we might evolve out of it. Okay, the how we got this government of police power is rooted in colonialism. Illan's book organizes a series of short chapters that each tell a whole portion of the larger story, is a tour of both intellectual history and of the conflict zones in which police models of governance were applied in the streets and further developed there. In one key chapter, he shows how Robert Peel's introduction of the Peace Preservation Force in 1814 in Ireland launched policing practices for the entirety of the British Empire. Each colonial police force trained in Dublin, or after Irish independence in Belfast and ultimately Palestine, sustaining for a century and a half an enormous training operation in paramilitary control that was also adapted by other nations. Okay, what I found particularly riveting is Illan's argument about what specifically the colonial model of policing targets. First, there's the bodies in the streets, certainly, but there's also the wider social movement the crowd represents. And at the same time, most deeply, the possibility of social movements in general manifested in the affective life of the populace. So episodes of public disorder, Illan argues, successfully challenge the legitimacy of the government's sovereignty, even when the government seems to be keeping an overall lid on things. But this is not because the populace has formulated policy demands or achieved superior powers of violence, but because its unrest signals an affective enmity towards the existing order, an enmity that the authorities did not anticipate and cannot predict a future direction for. Affects that appear in unrest presage fundamental political change. And I just stress that Illan's book has made the power of affects more convincing to me than almost anything else that I've read. And they presage a fundamental political change that in turn is based on the populace having actual experiences of its own sovereignty. Okay, so there's a lot going on here other than formal relations of power and a lot of encouragement to look beneath the surface of what appear to be existing power relations. And in my reading, at least, Illan is aiming directly at a decolonizing of the affective relation between the state and its populace, as he names it at one point. Everywhere, Illan says in his final paragraph, people begin to think about a public order that is not determined by the state. So in sum, I found this book quite inspiring. Okay, Illan's book also kicks off the ISRF's second season of book launches. We're about to publish a new ISRF bulletin on a theme that emerged over last year's 10 books, which is post-individualism. We mean by this a positive thing in which the individual is seen as necessarily constituted by its relations with diverse others, and where this self comes to see its traditional insistence on its radical priority to society as a fantasy or as an attack on the social, or both. Next month, on the 18th of November, the ISRF will go to Burnley FC to launch Mike McInwaite's new book On Burnley Road. an important study of toxic individuality's contribution to a white supremacist takeover of parts of that community and of the wider English political system. And then in December, we'll launch Alexander Stingel's Care, Power, Information on what he calls blue scholarship in an age still under the influence of global Trumpism. Translating an emerging model of heterodox post-individualism into social use will be a long process, but it has been advanced by the ISRF Fellows whose books we launched last year, by their 22 respondents who added their own insights and to whom I would again like to extend thanks, and also by the group gathered this evening, okay, which I now warmly welcome. As Lars mentioned, we'll start with Illan's overview of his book, which will run 10 or 15 minutes or so. And then we will proceed with our commentators, first with Professor Carolyn Pedwell coming to us, I think, from Kent. And then Dr. Lara Montesinas Coleman from Sussex. And then Illan may want to reply, and then we'll open it up for questions. I will introduce them then one at a time. So starting with Dr. Elaine Ruelwal, he is currently reader in law at the University of Warwick. He holds a BCL from University College Cork, an LLM from the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and a PhD from Birkbeck College, University of London. He is also co-director of the Centre for Critical Legal Studies at Warwick. Illan works on affective legal theory, critical legal theory, questions of protest and public order, theories of human rights and revolt, and new Andean constitutional apparatuses, in addition to many articles on those topics, as well as others such as turbulent legality, Tunisia and Agamben, and policing affect. He is the author of a 2013 book, also with Routledge, called Human Rights and Constituent Power Without Model or Warranty. Illan, it's really a pleasure to have you with us, and I want to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Chris. I think that was a lovely introduction, and to the book as well. Thank you for your kind words, and thank you also to Lars and Stuart for organising this, and to Carolyn and Lara for very generously commentating. So I'm going to give a broad overview of the book and try and just take you through the kind of 4 different movements which are within it. So let me start by just saying that there was a disagreement at the outset, just before I submitted the book, about what it was going to be called. Colin Perrin, who is my wonderful editor at Glasshouse Routledge, pushed for the title, which you see before you, Law and Disorder, because he said it was catchier, apparently, and because it signaled to people who might buy the book exactly what it was going to be about. But I wanted to call it The State of Unrest, because for me, this is what the book had become about. The book is an attempt to describe a condition in which the sovereign order itself has come unstuck. It is an attempt to describe a crisis of feeling for the sovereign order, alongside the possibilities that such a state presented, and the dangers as well. Because for me, the state of unrest is ultimately that moment where we approach a major change in a social or political order. It's the state of the situation, if you like, just before a revolution, or it is the state of the situation just before a moment of massive social repression. So in the state of unrest, the sovereign order realizes that it may not exist the next day, and so it reaches for its most intense and effective forms of violence. At the same time, in the state of unrest, the populace, or large swathes of the populace, begin to see new possibilities, new horizons of social ordering emerging. And so the book circles around this moment, this state, and attempts to pull it apart and help us see the questions of sovereignty and public order and crowds and protest and unrest through that particular lens. So let me double back and start at the beginning of the book to explain how we get to this moment of the state of unrest. So law and disorder begins with the insight that to be meaningful, sovereignty must ultimately be performed. And this means that it's never enough to simply identify and trace a rarefied set of sovereign figures or concepts. Sovereignty as an apparatus of power must be meaningful for the populace. It must appear to them. It must draw them in. as well as excluding and crushing and doing all the other things that we know that sovereign apparatuses do. So the book begins from an argument that it's essential to explore the ways in which sovereignty appears differently over time and place, manifesting different affective scenes and different affective registers at different moments. These sovereign scenes come in major and minor forms, and the book gives a very small number of examples of where sovereignty uses the modality of its appearance to generate or to refresh or to refocus the sovereign affects. It also uses this very basic introduction to the aesthetics of sovereignty to frame some of the methodological tools which are available for an analysis of the state of unrest. So Masumi and Berlin and Butler and Anderson and so forth, all of that gamut of different affective thinking is gestured towards at least or introduced in that first phase of the book. So then, drawing on a kind of post-Foucauldian distinction between government and sovereignty, the book then makes the first of its shifts. Instead of continuing to chart the different scenes of sovereign aesthetics, it switches over to the government of popular affects. Public order names the way in which the state addresses itself to the affective life of the populace, or one of the ways, I suppose. The book shows the way in which the public order apparatus can be conceptualized as a mode of intervention to maintain a docile populace. So as an aside here, it's worth pointing to the importance I attach to the term populace rather than the people or the population. The people is famously framed as the subject of popular sovereignty, and the population identifies the object of governmentality or biopolitics. The populace then sort of sits between these two figures of collectivity. It names a certain unstable juncture between dissensual demands of the people and the governmentality of the population. So the populace is both the object target of the security regime of public order, but it's also this kind of simmering space in which acts of resistance potentially emerge. In short, the populace is a way of thinking about the instability of population, so it's never just simply stable. The state's explicit desire to manage any possibility of the eruption of popular sovereignty. In other words, it's an attempt to think about the ways in which the state seeks to preclude at every possible moment the emergence of the people as the kind of ultimate subject of constituent power. So this second phase of the book then addresses a sort of genealogical mode. It seeks to trace the ways that public order or the sovereign's peace or the various different terms which are used for this apparatus, how that shifts in form, developing new strategies and tactics for the management of the populace. So the book focuses on the police power as a key site from which public order is developed and operationalized, as Chris has said. And it underscores the coloniality of contemporary public order management in the UK, at least, and around the world as well. This is because public order management has been gradually built up over 2 centuries or more in the British colonial possessions of Ireland and Malaysia and Kenya and Hong Kong. The dynamics of colonial government proved particularly productive precisely because the aim there was always the maintenance of order and the subjection of the populace. The state could never presume consent, but always had to work at subjugating and habituating the populace to its rule. So the book identifies, just as an example, it identifies a particular moment in the late 50s where a pair of Hong Kong police officers discover Gustave Le Bon, the infamous crowd theorist from the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. Inspectors John Lees and Leslie Guillet incorporate Le Bon's ideas on the fundamental irrationality and violence of crowds, as Le Bon claimed, to create a new mode of managing crowds. Although it's not the terminology that they use, I suggest that it opens this possibility of conceiving of crowded atmospheres. And in particular, using police formations to intervene in public order situations, to intervene against the crowd on an atmospheric level. In other words, instead of simply beating parts of the crowd until they dispersed or opening fire on them, as previous manuals had kind of imagined, these police officers instead began to think about the ways in which the police could appear and move and form and deform as a way of shifting the mood and the shared feelings of the crowds. In other words, they begin to think about the ways in which they can intervene in the affective life of the crowd without simply beating or shooting them. This, for me, I think, is the essential moment where contemporary public order management emerges. And it's really important, I think, that we trace that, the way in which those ideas which were developed in the late 50s and early 60s in Hong Kong then proliferate around the world very, very quickly, and are seen in the US and many other places within a decade. So the first half of the book explores the ways in which the state seeks to manage and discipline the populace. So we've got the sovereign aesthetics, how sovereignty is made to matter to the populace. And we have then the government of the affective life of the populace, or the broad security apparatus of public order. However, the book claims that it's not enough to understand the moment of unrest from the perspective of the state. And so halfway through, it flips the perspective, shifting focus away from the state and instead onto the crowd. The first step here is to see that the crowd is not inherently and in itself a kind of fascist formation, as some argued after the experience of the 30s in Europe. The German and Italian regimes certainly deployed a crowded aesthetics to ground their fascist states. However, this was a very particular deployment of crowds built around a sacrificial economy, around nation and so forth. While they relied heavily on crowds, it's not correct to simply reduce all crowd formations to fascism. Instead, I argue that crowds should be conceived as a form of political technology, a sort of perhaps an abject form of political technology. It's not the clean political technology that you often get in kind of Foucauldian studies. So this means that they can be deployed for any variety of ends. The fact that a crowd is involved in a particular political moment does not determine the politics of that assembly. However, as a political technology, crowds are particularly good at generating certain dynamics. The book in particular focuses in on the way that the crowd can generate atmospheres, using Jodie Dean and Judith Butler, among others, to frame different ways of thinking about how crowds can misassemble the space of politics, how they can disorder the space of politics. In particular, the book tries to pay close attention to the different ways in which crowds can be patterned. Identifying a political technology of crowds reveals the way we might understand different struggles over the way that crowds unfold as particularly important and meaningful. So the way into this for the book is to explore the atmospheres that crowds generate. So as the crowd comes back or stays over days and weeks, as it occupies squares or streets, the atmospheres of the crowd unfold in the moment in that kind of immediacy. However, they also begin to seep out. They can no longer be contained in the street or in the square. The atmosphere of the protest begins to affect the mood of the city, as Sarah Fregonese has recently written on in terms of security, cities with security issues. Or it shifts the national atmosphere, as Ann-Harriet Plus-Stevens calls it, or it begins to articulate with the structure of feeling, according to Raymond Williams. So in this context, the state of unrest it begins to emerge. So as the atmosphere of the crowd leaks out. I think we sometimes see this called crisis. And I think that's a useful way of coming at it to some extent. It's useful to ask ourselves about the way that a crisis as an affective constellation creeps into our flesh and bones. The crowd's atmosphere generates a quickening, a tightening in the gut as it spreads around a city. It creates a tremor of uncertainty in the rhythm of the city. When the crowd stays or returns for a particular period of time, often with fairly intense violence, then sometimes the tentacles of that affective constellation begin to reach out into the folds of the populace and begin to draw more and more people to the crowds. And here, recent examples of Hong Kong or Chile are particularly important. The state of unrest operates at many levels at once. It's there in the atmosphere of the public order situation, as the police call it. It's in the ambiances and rhythms of the city as the streets clear and the faint smell of tear gas and the smoke waft by. It burrows into the anatomy of national feeling, pulling the strings of attachment with fear and hope around the question of the new. And it resonates nationally and sometimes internationally with countries in similar situations. The state of unrest then is not a static form, but made up of multiple flows of affect. It's experienced differently by different people, depending on their mood, their situation, their status, etc. But actually, the state of unrest is most important for the sovereign order. The sovereign's peace, for it to work, it has to fade into the background, at least for the majority of the population. Only then can it be effective in shaping the desires and beliefs of the populace. The state of unrest undermines this calm normalization, which is supposed to take place for public order to operate normally. That kind of sense of calm as you walk down the street or something. Instead, the state of unrest makes public order on everyone's lips. The method of governing public order shifts gear from background surveillance to emergency provisions. The police start to gas people, they start to beat them and arrest them. Then, if it escalates, there are sniper rifles and semi-automatics, and finally, lethal force is potentially deployed. And in this moment, the state makes clear its power to debilitate and kill. This escalation intensifies the crisis of the sovereign order by fostering a greater sense of enmity. A state of enmity emerges. And new atmospheres and ambiances and affective flows that exceed the sovereign order begin to coalesce. And then we enter into a cycle of increasing enmity. How far will the state go? What will force protesters to stand down? In the ordinary course of things, the effective life of the populace is opaque. It's indeterminate. What is most remarkable about the state of unrest, however, is that in this moment of disorder, the effective life of the populace becomes less opaque. The tacit approval or habitual obedience that the sovereign order normally relies upon is disrupted. And instead, large swathes of the populace begin to express their rejection of the situation. They begin to express their rejection of the sovereign order. Increasingly, the enmity, the state of enmity determines the extent to which the state will continue or not. And in this way, I suggest the state of unrest is this most remarkable of moments. It gives us the most perfect point of contrast against which we can begin to see the effective management of the life of the populace. It shows us the potential of the crowd and helps us think and understand precisely why states are nervous whenever they see crowded protest. And this, I think, is ultimately the point of law and disorder, to identify a condition in which the sovereign order has become unstuck, to describe a crisis of sovereign sentiments. Thank you.
Carolyn Pedwell completed her PhD in gender studies at the LSE in 2007 and is currently professor of cultural studies and media at the University of Kent. Her research interests include digital media and culture, the politics of emotion and affect, habits and social change, the body and embodied practices, cultural and social theory, and feminist, queer, critical race, and decolonial theories. Her 2020-21 Lieberhume Fellowship, Digital Media and the Human, the Social Life of Software, AI, and Algorithms, explores how digital, smart, and computational media may be radically transforming the human. She is the author of 3 books, Feminism, Culture, and Embodied Practice, The Rhetorics of Comparison, which came out in 2010, Affective Relations, The Transnational Politics of Empathy, which came out in 2014. And this year she has published Revolutionary Routines, The Habits of Social Transformation, which I think is great. It explains how and why the theory and practice of social change needs to move beyond ethics or through ethics to habits and the theorization of how habits work democratically. Everybody should read this book. Right. Carolyn, over to you. Thank you for being here.
And thanks for the opportunity to be here, and for Illan for writing such an amazing book. This was on my list to read, but having the invitation to kind of respond to it really made that happen sooner rather than later. I think for me, Illan's focus on the crowd was so generative and compelling as a way to open up some of the writing that I've already been familiar with around affective governance, sovereignty and the exception, and the carceral state more widely. And I think as Chris and Illan mentioned in their talks, this focus on tracing some of the colonial genealogies and reverberations that are behind some of these effective technologies was really fascinating, and I think crucial part of the book. How do techniques that are worked out and tested in Hong Kong in the 1950s then reverberate back as a mode of effective technology for policing the minor strikes in the 1980s and onwards? One of the things that struck me about this book is the really wide range of evocative examples that are used to think about how do we understand the relationships between the state, disorder, sovereignty, affect, and the crowd. Everything from the storming of the Bastille to the affective staging of sovereignty at the 2011 royal wedding, to thinking about our unfolding affective present of the global pandemic. And alongside this, I think the richness and the nuance of Illan's analysis, how we are given all of these rich examples of the ways of managing and governing unrest, and what combination of particular affective, material, and psychosocial practices of choreographing affect are employed to constitute, to manage, to shape the populace back to a presumed state of habitual calm or restiveness once a state of unrest has emerged or has been threatened. But I think Illan usefully shows how it's not this simple, that affect gets mobilized or choreographed in quite complex and perhaps surprising or unexpected ways in particular moments and contexts. Personally, I found the discussion of kettling as a more contemporary practice. I think that certainly for myself and probably others in the UK became subject to and very familiar with from the student protests against the introduction of, or the rise of, university fees from 2010 onwards. And Illan describes how in kettling kind of people in a certain limited area, often for hours on end without access to food or medical help or whatever else might be needed, is not necessarily straightforward. It might be to create a state of just utter exhaustion after all these hours, which kind of means that this crowd is more likely to disperse in a more passive way because they're simply tired and want to get home. But it might also in particular circumstances be a mode of accelerating or igniting affect, of actually increasing irritation and aggression to make certain elements of the crowd stand out and act violently in certain ways so that they can be pulled out, put under surveillance, made an example of in particular ways. So I was really struck by the complexity of affective management and choreography that Illan was able to bring out through the book. Another thing I want to say about this book is really to think about the wonderful experimentation in writing and form that it stages. And I think within affect theory and affect studies in their contemporary forms since their inception, one of the really important objective, I guess, is to think about how do we write affect differently or otherwise? How do we perhaps move away from or think about the traditional academic essay otherwise? And I really feel like this book does that in such a fascinating way. As was mentioned, it's a collection of, I think, 19 or around that number, short chapters that, as Illan says, have the effect of kind of crowding together or falling quickly one after another, giving a sense of more and more texture and different sensory experiences and different angles of affective patterning being played out through this form. And they're interspersed with 4 excursuses. Excursuses? I don't know what the plural of that is. And these are a kind of break in the flow of this crowd that's been assembled, a kind of way to step back from what's been happening and to reflect and to introduce some kind of theoretical points of orientation and coordinates. And so in this way, I think for me, what the book does is its incisiveness, its criticality, the power of his argument doesn't come from simply kind of arguing in a traditional form, but from performing that in a very kind of sensory and affective way. It performs its argument rather than makes it, perhaps you could say. So I had 3 questions that emerged from the book that I wanted to put to Illan and to the gathering today. The first one is about the role of difference in both kind of constituting and managing the populace or the population in particular contexts. There's a really powerful moment, I think, in the middle of the book where you turn to the police murder of Eric Garner and his haunting words, "I can't breathe," and how this moment, among many others, but really this particular moment just brings into really clear and horrible focus how the populace, you know, of course, is never homogenous, and how the modes of policing, governing, staging, intervening, kind of all the techniques of the carceral state are, of course, always differentiated. And there's always bodies that are marked and approached as more, in the words you use, suspect than other bodies. And I guess what I wanted to say is that obviously, of course, this is more than a moment. And I wondered if actually this type of difference is actually not something that just comes up and becomes palpable in particular moments, but is actually central to and constitutive of the types of affective governance and staging of sovereignty and kind of the manifestations of the carceral state that you're interested in. And I think this is in fact your argument and comes through the colonial genealogy that you weave through your discussion, but I just wondered maybe if you could say a bit more about that. And I think when I was reading, for me most recently, it's the policing of the vigil around the death of the murder of Sarah Everard by a police officer during the pandemic that kind of stood out there as kind of one way that we've been trying to think through the gendered, classed, racialized, and geopolitical differences and particularities that are evident there. The second question I wanted to pose was, how might we understand the relationship between the crowd and the digital, and kind of these pervasive algorithmic architectures that are coming to structure so much of our everyday social lives? There's a really interesting part in the fourth excursus where you talk about Carl Schmitt talking about public opinion. And I just wanted to read it really quickly, because you say Schmitt's reference to public opinion is interesting because he later explains that it should not be understood as the sum of all individual votes. He imagines an apparatus which would allow every person to continuously express his opinions on political questions without ever leaving his apartment. This, he explains, would not capture public opinion. It would merely be an aggregation of all the many private opinions. And of course, I think this conjures for a contemporary audience like ours, all the debates around the politics of social media, clicktivism and so forth, and actually what mode of politics is this? And I wanted to ask you whether the crowd can be digital, or how do we think about algorithmically mediated crowds? Because your discussion of the crowd is so sensory and so embodied. You talk about Teresa Brennan and kind of affective communication, that what's happening when we participate in the crowd is not something that's only immaterial, it's actually material. We're talking about changes in the body at a molecular level. So how do we think, for example, in Black Lives Matter or Occupy or kind of all the movements since, the really important role of social media and other digital platforms in that, in terms of how we think about where the crowd might play out, the different kind of spaces beyond the street and the square. And the third question, which I won't elaborate on for time, was kind of how you understand the relationships between the affective and the habitual. Having just written my own book on habit, which of course you know because you reviewed, I couldn't help attending to every spot where you mentioned habit or the habitual. It seemed at certain times that kind of the habitual was what usually kept things the same, what kept things restive and calm, but then unrest would kind of be an effective diversion or force that kind of allowed something, whether good or bad, to kind of emerge from that. But of course, I was also wondering about how habits or the habitual might also be part of change. So if there's any time, I'd love to hear more about that. So I'm going to end there, but thank you so much for writing such a brilliant book.
Our second and final commentator is Lara Montesinas Coleman. She is a reader in international relations, law and development, and also co-director of the Center for Global Political Economy at the University of Sussex. She holds an undergraduate degree in philosophy and theology from the University of Oxford, MS degrees in international relations and research methods from the University of Bristol, where she also completed her PhD. She joined the IR department at Sussex in 2012. Sample publication titles will help explain why we rushed to invite her to this event. The Violence of the Peace is one, The Gendered Violence of Development. The third is The Making of Docile Dissent, which is very much on the agenda today. And out this year, a particular favorite of mine, Marxism, Coloniality, and Ontological Assumptions. Between 2014, and 2016, Lara held an ISRF Early Career Fellowship for the project Discipline, Dissent, and Dispossession. Her book, Struggles for the Human, should be out about a year from now, at which point we will hasten to launch it. Lara, thanks for coming. Turn it over to you.
And yeah, thanks for inviting me, and especially for the opportunity to read Illan's book, which I really enjoyed. I won't repeat any of Carolyn's points that I really, very much agreed with about all the strengths that Carolyn brought out. But I guess I wanted to kind of tie this back particularly to the question of protest, and something that I really appreciated in your book was, it really changed how I thought about protest. And I think that's one of the best things, the best books are often those ones that you read them and then, you finish thinking, actually, why wasn't that obvious to me beforehand? And I think that's what your book did for me. I was previously very much, I teach a third year course on protest, and really thinking about this very much through the lens of visibility, that the idea of protest is, I think comes from the Latin protestare, to kind of declare publicly. And I was thinking much more around, the cognitive, the ways in which protests might expose hidden forms of violence or expose lives that don't count as lives, or how new social forces might emerge, new resisting subjects become visible, which, I guess isn't so far in many ways from aspects of your discussion over on Sierra or Sorrel, on Duremption in the book, or on the idea of performative violence, staging this violence that already exists. But, the thing I've always struggled with about protest, when as a participant, as well as teaching or writing about protest, is like, well, aren't there other ways of making visible, of denouncing, that are more effective? So, why protest? And I think, your insight that why protest matters, because it can radically reconfigure the effective valence of a situation, I just found really powerful. So partly thank you, and partly that means I have to change part of my teaching for next year now, because I'm going to need to incorporate your discussion. But I wanted to put this into dialogue a bit with some other cases, and actually it relates to some of the examples that Chris was talking about at the beginning. And just to think about, okay, so then if we think about protest through this effective lens, what about those cases when, the sovereign order doesn't come unstuck? And I thought I'd just put it into dialogue a bit with Mark Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism, in which he's got a chapter, what if you organized a protest and everyone came? He's talking very much about anti-capitalist protests in Britain. And he also, really captures an atmosphere, a pervasive sense of political exhaustion, cultural sterility, in Britain a decade ago or so, when he says, capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizon of the thinkable. And in that context, protest becomes this kind of carnivalesque background noise that's performed against pantomime villain corporations and politicians, staging these demands that no one really expects to be met. And alongside this focus on atmosphere, Fisher's got this much more psychoanalytic angle, thinking about the unacknowledged desires and beliefs that we might have when we're engaged in protest. And we might well be aware that capitalism's ruthless in human terms, that it's ecologically unsustainable, but we might engage in protest, but we still continue to consume and invest and acquiesce with the commodity form, which is part of his analysis of why things don't come unstuck. why protest has become part of this carnivalesque background noise. And I was thinking of this in relation to your book, because what I found so powerful about your discussion of affect is just how it might capture aspects of why this sort of anti-capitalism, hasn't seeped out and shifted the atmosphere. It hasn't, brought about effective change. And this idea of protests, the protests of the late 90s and early 2000s as this, carnivalesque background noise. There was lots of celebration, all this another world is possible, hailing this big global subject, this anti-globalization movement. But there are many aspects, there wasn't this kind of sense of enmity that you really draw out so beautifully, that it doesn't break down that sort of ideological fantasy, the acquiescence with capitalism. So here's where I think your analysis of violence and enmity is really provocative. How the crowds actually learn enmity, they learn through the process of protest, through the experience of repression. Well, we were always already at war. But then I wonder also if there's something to be said here, and I'll come back to this in a minute, about the importance of protest also being rooted in place and context. And is that something different with the big anti-globalization protests, even where there was, huge unrest, the battles of Seattle and Genoa, are the issues at stake, too abstract, too at a distance for the populations, for the affect to seep out around that protest, because of the way that many of the anti-globalization protests were kind of separated from place and context? Did that give them a kind of lack of effective force? But there's another aspect of this I also wanted to think about when thinking about the failure of a protest to really shift the effective register in a way that seeps out and is sustainable and really ignites a populace. And that was relates very much actually to Carolyn's question on the relationship between the crowd and the digital realm. But to what extent is this seeping out of atmosphere potentially hampered and counteractive by media technologies of rendering protest visible in particular ways, which carry this myth of they're completely transparent, you're getting a direct view into it, but can they really capture the ways in which the effective valence is shifted on the ground? And then in the ways in which they also fuel what you were talking about, the state's practice of dissimulating its own violence and representing protesters as violent. So I guess a question that would come out of that then is how does atmosphere seep, or how is it hindered through virtual means? How do different forms of technology of reporting, both the discursive aspect, but also the, what can the medium actually do to convey these effective shifts or potentially hinder it? And this got me thinking a bit about also the role of art and about, aesthetic aesthetic practices and art as also forms of effective counter-tactics. So, how can, say if we're online, how can atmosphere also be created and propelled out from a protest? So I guess this relates to what you talked about around the role of myth that's generated by unrest. But how can effective strategies, and can effective strategies be carried online in ways that can actually help build and sustain mass movements that come out of protest? And then I also wondered, and this is I'm not sure I've quite pinned down this question yet, if there's possibly a missing element about how potentially, even when a protest has shifted the effective dynamics of a situation, can this seeping out of atmosphere from protest also sometimes be reabsorbed in ways that can stabilize the existing order? So you talk about the role of myth and opening up the possibility of a sense of possibility without pinning down what those possibilities are, which I think is really powerful and resonates very much. And I take a lot from that. But then I was also thinking about Black Lives Matter protests, and recently all these statues of slavers being torn down, and then sort of spiraling out into more efforts to decolonize curricula in schools and universities and so on. But then where's the actual systemic change? Where are the concrete demands for it that come out of this movement? And I was wondering, okay, unrest might be a necessary condition of possibility for shifts in the political order. But it might be insufficient for building an effective social movement because the atmosphere can dissipate. But also, are there ways in which the myth, the aesthetic and affective aspects of a protest, perhaps in an example like Black Lives Matter, can become almost kind of commodified, taken up into decolonizing, these other sorts of efforts that can sort of give a false sense of energy without change actually happening. And then finally, I just wanted to think of an example that it's also really resonated with me from a different context, which is Colombia, which, I mean, as Illan knows, I've worked in Colombia for quite a while. And your discussion of Fanon, and how unrest can produce effective states that are already there, I found also very powerful. And I thought that the recent general strike in Colombia is a really good example of this. So this is very much an unrest that is grounded immediately in context, so it actually spilling out from a context. So it began on the 28th of April this year as a protest against a tax reform that meant more austerity for the most impoverished in the country. And it turned into a movement that has been demanding the right to protest, the protection of social leaders, the demand to stop environmental destruction and dispossession. And there have been huge numbers killed and injured, disappeared, raped, and despite huge government manipulation of data, it's impossible to kind of sustain this myth that it's just a few bad apples in the police force. And this is a context where, there were already really strong social movements. People, you could say, already knew they were already at war in this context of intense repression. But I think, there's been a durability to this strike precisely through what you talk about, the kind of atmosphere that's created. And the key aspect that you draw from Fanon when you transpose his insights to Chile or Hong Kong is that the protest actually produces an effective state that was already there. So I think, again, coming back to that, the difference with, say, the battles of the anti-globalization movement and so on, there's something, another aspect, I think, that I'm trying to get at about how atmosphere can seep out from a protest and capture a populace, bring into being new social movements, new resisting subjects and social forces. And I think that's got something to do with place and context. And perhaps the sort of argument you're making works more for protests that come out really grounded in place and context, even if they are addressing big global issues and legacies of colonialism, which protests in Colombia certainly are. And then I was also thinking about, again, when does sovereignty become unstuck, the sovereign order become unstuck? And is this effective focus sufficient here? And I'm not saying you're trying to say that this is sufficient, but I think I can totally agree that this shift in the effective valence is necessary. But I think there's also a lot to be said about how ideas get taken up, from a history of struggle, of pre-existing struggle that is bound up with a particular protest. So how pre-existing social movements can really strengthen those effective dynamics, but also translate them into ideas that are already kind of part of social movement struggles on the ground. And then finally, you talk about state of unrest very much in an urban setting, and in the urban setting of protest. And this just got me thinking about, what about contexts like Colombia? So now talking about rural parts of the country where you've got ongoing states of unrest, you've got the state declaring long states of internal commotion, huge repression of people, very much, you know, an understanding that we're at war, we've been at war for a long time. And is there something, does your sort of analysis still play out there with the sorts of protests and mobilizations and dynamics of oppression that might take place in a rural context of unrest, in a much more ongoing situation of unrest and internal conflict? Or is there something about the city and something about the, you know, the ways, the crowd in the city that means that it's not translatable? I mean, my own sense is there's quite different sorts of affective dynamics that come out of protest and cycles of policing of protest in a rural context. So I just wanted to throw that one out there. And then finally, I couldn't help reading your book with also my eye on the fact that, you know, that we're about to be balloted in this country for industrial action. And I was thinking, okay, what are the lessons of Illan's book for the picket line for teach outs and for how to organize an effective strike? So I'll finish there and hand back to Illan.
These are really fantastic questions, and there's kind of so much to say to a lot of them. Let me start with Carolyn to begin with. Then, on that question of the role of difference, I think is really well put, and I think is something that I've been thinking about after the book was published more and more. So I began to, well, I mean, I had bookmarked a whole literature in the Black radical tradition, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s. That kind of question of the internal colony seemed like a really important moment where a tradition emerges out of, you know, what public order would identify as the suspect population, the dangerous supplement that potentially unsettles things. And there is a fascinating set of ideas which develop, you know, from 65, 66 onwards through into the early 70s, and which is then operationalized in the Black Panther policing of the public order stops, the stops of cars in California of Black people. And I think from that comes a really interesting question of the nature of normality, or the nature of calm, as I put it in the book, and the ways in which that calm is produced for a majority of the population, but which then produces a whole series of suspect populations who have to be really, really intensely managed. And I think some of the insights from that literature, I think, are really useful for thinking about, you know, things like the London riots, indeed Black Lives Matter, and indeed I think, you know, some of the more recent stuff coming out of Black Lives Matter draws on a lot of that literature as well, even as it strips away some of the kind of problematic gender politics and politics around sexuality and so forth, which was sometimes part of that. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a really important question about the public for whom public order is produced on a day-to-day basis. The second question about the digital, this is the question I get asked the most, and like, as you were saying it, I thought to myself, I can't believe that I still don't have a really good answer to that. So I guess I've resisted the tendency to identify this with the digital sphere, to think about the crowd as digital, precisely because of that materiality of atmosphere that I really want to hold on to. And, you know, so I did some work on the Arab Spring, and I often get students wanting to do work on it, and the go-to question for them is always, oh, look at this Facebook revolution. And I just think that's the most dreadful reading of this moment, because it misses the materiality of the revolution. It misses the way in which the organization actually took place. Now, I think obviously, you know, Facebook and other social media outlets were really important for that in terms of organizing and publicizing both the kind of the images and the videos and so forth, and also for organizing, you know, when events would take place and how they would take place and so forth. But I also think that there's something going on where a European audience is trying to almost appropriate, or maybe appropriate is too strong a word, but, you know, also claim ownership of this moment, where people can you know, say, oh, it's a Facebook revolution, I was on Facebook at the time, I supported stuff, therefore, you know, I too am part of it. And that, I think, is just the worst, you know, the worst type of liberal understanding of a protest. I'm not saying that's what you were saying at all. You know, I think this is something my students so often fall into. And I think I'd want to kind of resist that at all costs and insist upon that kind of the importance of the materiality of being there. And that then I think also goes to Lara's question about place, and your first question about capitalism versus the state, and then the later questions around place and context. Because I think that's exactly right, that this theory of protest, this theory of public order, works primarily in an urban setting, and works primarily around the state and sovereignty and that whole apparatus. And I think when we start thinking about anti-capitalist protests, then precisely the target is, you know, it's the state as well, but the state is almost an intermediary between, you know, for global capital, and there's an attempt to kind of demonstrate and identify and sensitize towards the dynamics of global capitalism. And I think this theory doesn't work as well for that at all. I don't think. I think it's there was a review in Law and Literature which came out the day before yesterday, and Emilius Christodoulidis, who supervised or was an external on my PhD many years ago, made precisely this point, that the book, I think, you know, capitalism is in there in lots of different ways, and it talks about anti-capitalist protests, but I think it to some extent struggles to explain and to engage with those moments of anti-capitalism. Lara's question around the Colombia example in terms of the general strike, and that question around rural and urban settings, I think, is really useful. So Colombia, I've done a tiny bit of work, nothing like the work that Lara's done on Colombia, and I've kind of continually engaged. I work with Carolyn Pedwell at Los Andes, and it's something which I've been really fascinated by in the last, well, since the general strikes started. And I think precisely because it is I mean, I think, you know, without sounding too pompous, but I think the theory can be applied there. I think you're right, though, that there is also so much else happening there with, you know, the kind of the history of conflict there makes things so much more complicated and so much more difficult to pull apart the kind of affective dynamics as I've done here. And I think that simple kind of idea of diremption, which I draw from Sorel, I think works to some extent, but also risks oversimplifying the types of diremptions that might happen, the types of enmity which emerge, and the ways in which they're put into effect. Just going back to Carolyn's third question about the relations between the affective and the habitual. So, you know, I had that moment where reading your book after my book had gone in, and so I'd read bits and pieces of it as I was going along, but reading the book finally kind of in its final version, I had exactly the same set of thoughts around like the types of habits which emerge in the crowd, which is why I found your work so generative as well. The types of habits which emerge in the moment of unrest, I think, are really interesting. And I think using habit, not just as a sort of way of thinking about sovereign order and sovereign ordering, but also thinking about it as a way into thinking about how social change happens on a kind of a capillary level, I think, is a really useful way of thinking about it, and it's something which I certainly plan to work on some more. I think that's all I have. Yeah, just on the last question of the strike, the strike which is probably coming, I think Warwick, I think, is the best example of how to destroy a strike, because it's, you know, a good whatever 1960s university. It has 50 million entrances. The space is all really open. There are very few contained spaces. It's very difficult to get that feeling of a crowd, even in the height of whatever the first strike was, where we had, you know, a couple of hundred people there. The space always felt empty. There was no intensity. There was no, you know, no focus. And actually, those universities were built for that. You know, so I'm still struggling to get my hands on it, but there is a series of texts which discuss the production of an unprotestable university, essentially. So I know this from UCD in Ireland was precisely produced along these lines. It was an attempt to open spaces. To UNSW in Sydney is something similar, where there are specific designs around splitting crowds up and steps to slow them down. And you know, there's a whole kind of architecture of the modern university which is built around preventing student protest or undermining it. And I think that kind of articulation of space and context with the atmospheres which can be produced is something which is really interesting and really worthwhile thinking about. When it comes to the strike, then it makes some places much harder to effectively picket, I think. And it doesn't help that the entire public order apparatus built around strikes in the UK, really invasive use of strike regulation, you know, prevents, you know, for instance, the strike regulations in the UK suggest that there shouldn't be more than 6 people on a picket, because anything more than that risks causing duress and undermining people's choice about whether or not they fulfill their contract and all this sort of rubbish. So I think, you know, combining the spatial dynamics of the contemporary university with the legal apparatus is designed to prevent that type of atmosphere, that type of those sorts of effects generated in that moment. I think it makes, you know, genuine, effective striking sometimes quite difficult.
2 equally massive and important questions to answer from the audience. The first one is from Hillary D. Following on from Lara's discussion or question, thinking about how protest can act as a pressure valve, releasing something that is building up across society before adequate organizing and strategizing has taken place, and how to shift the focus from obsessive mobilization and repetitions of protest repertoires that end up channeled into state-centric agendas or tactical freeze. So the question is, does affect relate to organizing as opposed to mobilizing?
So that's a really interesting question. And I guess the thrust of Law and Disorder is to suggest that, so let me just contrast the different views. So you say protest operates as a pressure valve, it releases pressure before the organization can happen, which then means that the protest comes and go, presumably. But the thrust of Law and Disorder is that actually, you know, that you can have protests which organize and which return over and again, and in so doing they don't act as a pressure valve releasing pressure. In fact, they intensify the pressure and they generate more tension rather than releasing the tensions. So I think something like the student protests in the UK in, what is it, 2011, 2012, is a really good example there. You know, for a variety of different reasons, the students focused on the change of law around the fees, and so they protested the 3 weeks leading up to the vote, culminating on the day of the vote. And what happened was, you know, the first day there was, you know, some clashes with police. Kids broke into the Tory HQ. There was, you know, stuff thrown from the roof. It was really controversial, hit the news. It was, you know, a really big event. And then the police started amping up the pressure for the next one. And so they talked about, you know, dangerous forces entering in from the students. They talked about, you know, the feckless students who, you know, didn't have anything better to do, and the conservative media started ramping up the idea that they were, you know, should have been away studying. But actually what's happening in that is that the pressure, I think, is intensifying, and it's intensifying and it's intensifying, so that by the final day you get the biggest crowds, you get, you know, some of the most intense violence, you get some of the biggest spectacle. And I think, you know, if the timing of this had been different, if we can enter a kind of imaginary scenario where it wasn't, you know, whatever, a couple of days before Christmas, and if the students had returned again and had continued that and had continued to ramp up the pressure, then I think you would have had a very different situation. And I think you would have had you know, that you wouldn't have had that exhaustion, that destruction of the sentiments which happened at the end of the last set of protests. And I think, you know, when we look back at something like, and this is obviously a totally different scale and, you know, different context, but look back at something like May 68 in Paris, you have precisely that. You have an opening into the summer, so you have a much kind of bigger time scale. You have instead of hail and snow, you've got, you know, nice weather. You have a whole set of people organized and organizing around the streets and the clashes with police and so forth. So you have a very different set of dynamics, which I think intensify rather than coming to a dead stop, which inevitably leads to exhaustion. So I'm not disagreeing with you that protest can be a pressure valve. I'm not saying that, you know, protests sometimes can't leave people exhausted, but I do think that there is a place for protests and the atmospheres of those protests reshaping the way in which people think of themselves and think of the movement, and leading to an increasing level of tension rather than an evaporation of that tension.
That's great. Thanks, Elaine. And then Anna Wall has a related question, which is this: what happens to a group's affect when a protest movement is dissipated or thwarted in some way? What are the social and political consequences of those unmet needs and demands? To experience we've all had.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. It's something which has really, so I went to Hong Kong immediately after the 2014 protests and interviewed a whole host of activists there. It's something which I've never managed to publish for a variety of different reasons in any sort of substantive way. But it, for me, it was really, really interesting that almost universally, everybody talked about the feeling of exhaustion. Everybody talked about the closure of horizons, the idea that they could never imagine going back on the streets again. And I thought that was something that was really, really interesting. It's really interesting, particularly when you contrast that with the 2019 protests. And you understand that the people who were protesting in 2014 are often the people who are on the streets again in 2019. And what they say in 2019 is, you taught us that peaceful protest doesn't work. So there's a closure or an exhaustion of a particular mode or a particular repertoire of protest, which then leads people to rethink the way in which they take to the streets and the types of affects and atmospheres which they seek to produce. So instead of the kind of calm, peaceful, everybody sitting down studying together, you know, reading groups and you know, the umbrella as the symbol. Instead of all of that, you have the umbrella as a weapon. You have a turn to, you know, be water rather than, you know, so melting away in front of the police. So I think sometimes we look at exhaustion and we say it's a negative sentiment, and of course it is. But I think exhaustion is also really important for generating different ways in or different modes of engaging. And I say that as well from the perspective of the police, because the police are fascinated by the techniques which they use to and their efficacy. And what you find is a constant attempt to find the ways of exhausting protesters and exhausting the sentiments and moving beyond the crowd to the social movement beyond it, as Chris said at the very beginning. And so kettling was introduced precisely for that, you know, trialed in the late 90s and really kind of rolled out in the noughties as a response to the anti-globalization protests. But as kettling itself became more and more controversial in the late noughties, the police have instead, in the UK at least, have turned to a very different mode of organizing crowds, which is based primarily around surveillance and mood sensing within the crowds in an attempt to be much more dynamic and cunning, I guess, in some ways. And so I think the understanding as well that the police's techniques become exhausted at particular moments, and they then use that idea of exhaustion as a way of thinking about how to better control the crowd, which is going to emerge, I think is a useful tool. So exhaustion is helpful for us to think through, I think, and important. Yeah.
Carolyn, did you want to jump in? It looked like you were about to say something.
Not really. I just saw that there was a third question that related kind of to the digital and the cloud, and that was one point I might come back to if there's time.
Yeah, let me ask this third question, and I want to frame it a little bit, because I feel like there are sort of three models of sort of good protest that we're working with, and Angus MacDonald, as the last question, is sort of doing the third. I mean, one is one that you mentioned in relation to Hong Kong, in which there's kind of an escalation of the power of violence, so that the students just become more used to being beaten and attacked physically and are able to deal with that kind of confrontationally. And some of it is, we're going to retreat strategically and we're going to peer somewhere else. But a lot of it is just simply being able to match kind of a rapport of force. The second seems to be more a mechanism that really fascinated me, and that was the emergence of the hidden, and then maintaining the continuous emergence of the hidden. So you can't just have an affect that surfaces or becomes unveiled, that the state or the authorities or the police didn't expect once. You have to kind of, that has to keep happening in order to, so it's not about violence, it's about this unveiling of the crowd's affect, or the unveiling of the unknown thing. And this may actually be, I don't think it's the same as what Angus MacDonald is asking about, but it, so I'll just call it as a third. And he says, forensic architectures show cloud studies, could have been called crowd studies. They offered analyses of clouds traces, the point being that clouds/crowds don't leave traces necessarily, but both post hoc technology and theory produce these otherwise invisible traces. Is this your mission statement?
Hi, Angus. I know Angus really well. So that idea that crowds disappear and dissipate, I think, is something which is really, really interesting. I mean, I have a book called Cloud and Crowd, and it's never really grabbed me. I'm also still back in the middle of Derek McCormack's Atmospheric Things, which is all about, you know, clouds and bubbles and things like that. I don't know that it necessarily works for me. I'm much more excited by that kind of feeling of being around people, and the idea that it dissipates, I think, is true in many ways. So, like, you know, we can think of various different atmospheric places we've been, and the, you know, the way maybe they're interrupted, or that maybe we leave and we no longer are subject to the same set of atmospheres. And I think that's obviously the case with protests as well. But I think also it's really important to remember that the traces happen, the traces continue within us, where it's not that we are completely untouched by a moment of crowded protest, or, well, maybe we are, maybe it's super boring. Like, I was on one of the Iraq war protests years and years ago, and it was the most tedious thing. Or I went along to some of the Brexit ones just to see what they were like, and they were the most boring things I've ever seen. I think probably I was untouched by them, although maybe I was touched by the boredom. But anyway, you know, I think we are changed by those moments of being, particularly where we end up close to that spectacular moment. So I was in one of the student protests and was kettled. I think Carolyn was talking about that earlier, and you know, that had a real effect, I think. And I remember talking to these, I mean, they were children, they were 15 and 16, and them just saying, like, you know, how can the state do this to us? How can the police do this to us? And I remember thinking that, like, this is going to be one of those moments which changes them. And actually, when we look at the left, which emerges in the UK post 2011, a lot of the major figures, you know, for better or worse, Novara Media and all of that, come precisely out of the student protests. So I think those moments had an incredible effect on people as they were coming through. So I think thinking about it just in terms of clouds and dissipating, you know, it rains and then it's gone, I think that's probably not good. Although, just thinking about the metaphor, maybe we get wet after we've been rained on. So anyway, yes, I'll stop.
Carolyn, do you want to say something about the digital?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of related. I appreciate, Ilan, your desire to really want to hold on to the materiality of being there. And I think being there in all sorts of different ways. I guess the only concern I have is sometimes when we want to make these arguments, we rely on a kind of online, offline binary that I just don't think holds up anymore, like in the kind of pervasively algorithmically mediated kind of environment we're in. So I'm thinking of the student protests even in 2010, which is kind of like early days of social media platforms. But like, you know, there was an app designed just really quickly on the spot to try to help people not get kettled, and to try to kind of, so people could upload like, well, there's a kettle up there, or there's police there. So like, you know, divert off onto these different roads and stuff. So I guess I'm also thinking about the affective nature of the digital and algorithmic mediation of the protest itself on the street, and what difference that might make. And also, I think, as you mentioned, the kind of increasingly sophisticated surveillance mechanisms that are being used by the state and the police to kind of that are using social media and facial recognition technology to preempt people even participating in a protest before they get there. So they can't even be there in that way because they've been machine learning technologies have been used to kind of preempt that possibility.
Yeah, you're absolutely right to put me up on that. That is absolutely true. And you know, so I'm in the middle of a Leverhulme grant application with Chris Zabrowski in Loughborough precisely about some of these questions. So one of the things that we want to look at is around tensions indexing, something which kind of emerged in the 70s as a way of thinking about you know, the social tensions which exist, and whether or not we could predict, or police could predict, protests and predict particularly intense protests or race riots dependent on that, which is then picked up in the 90s and then into the current era again. And now, instead of a kind of analyst sitting down in a dark room and trying to think about whether or not there are tensions in society using the data gathered from various different police forces, instead you have social media and, you know, as you say, complex algorithmic analysis of tension words within social media, which then allow police to try and map when populations are more likely to be restive and when they're more likely to be calm. And so I think you're absolutely right. Like that crossover between the digital and the material is, you know, there's a complete interspersal of it. I guess what I really struggle with is the identification of causality with Facebook or with social media, that this is and I think it's just I'm allergic to that kind of media narrative about the Arab Spring in particular, but I think it has happened since then. And I think you're right. Like, so some of the work of Louise Moore, for instance, on the ways in which the algorithmic and the material kind of wind together in ever more complex ways, I think is really insightful and helpful to think through some of these kind of really knotty, problematic questions.
Where I want to ask if you have any thoughts at this point, and I also want to ask a final question before we stop that goes back to something that I think Hillary and Anna were raising.
I just had one more thought as you were responding to the question about context, and you know, I'm not so sure that it's necessarily about where, or it's not just about this question of, is it, you know, an anti-capitalist protest that's not dealing with the state versus one that's addressing the state, you know, directly. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, I don't know if you know Andre Joinville's work, his book, A History of World Order and Resistance, but he talks about this idea of an anti-capitalist dialectic of presence, which I think really, in some way, he doesn't talk about affect, but I think it really relates to your sort of argument. So I think what he would say about the, you know, the Seattle protest, that, you know, the big anti-globalization protests, you know, isn't just that they're kind of carnivalesque and there's not enough enmity being generated in this situation, but there's also what he calls like kind of a severance, and you get these kind of abstract subjects caught up in these abstract universalities, whereas, you know, he's sort of looking historically at sort of when protests have been successful, and you have this, you know, dialectics of presence that he calls it. So the protest emerges out of a really concrete context and situation, which you can see, you know, the protests in Colombia, they come out of these tax reforms, but actually they're about an entire sort of neoliberal, neocolonial order. And from there, from that concrete situation, connecting up with the sort of global critique of capitalism, of coloniality. And then that kind of comes back into invest struggles on the ground. So they're not just local, they're not just national, but there's this kind of grounding in place and context, and this ability to get the support and the, and you know, and I think the support of the populace, but also the way in which your analysis of affect really, I think, adds to that, adds to what place and context means.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I don't know the history of the world order or whatever it is. I've half written it down now. But I think, like, so what I was trying to get at was that like so for instance, let's take a strike as a really, you know, like the miners' strike or one of these kind of big national strike moments. And so, you know, in a way that is a I guess a protest against, an anti-capitalist protest in some way. But it is engaged at a kind of national level to some extent, and at a local level, as you say. And of course, both of those then draw in the kind of question of global capitalism and so forth in that, but there is something proximate to be struggled with and against. And so I think, you know, there's something in that which is, you know, which is quite different to the anti-capitalist and anti-globalization movement. That description of that abstract universality, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. One of the people, and I'm always slightly ashamed to say this, but you know, Burke's thinking had a really generative effect on me at a fairly early stage. Not the kind of horrible conservatism of it, but that idea of that. I mean, so it comes out of a critique of rights as a sort of an abstract form rather than a kind of a living, embodied practice. And so you know, the French Declaration is an abstract one which is not born out of particular, you know, social economic relations, as distinct from, you know, the moral economy of the crowd, as E.P. Thompson would much later point to, as a kind of a living mode of struggle against particular forms, which has a universal element. And so I think, you know, I think that it's that sort of set of dynamics which I'm interested in, and which I think are help perhaps point to the limitations of the work, because I think it's also really important to say this isn't a universal attempt to explain all protests and strikes and riots and everything like that. Like, I think that sort of universal theory of protest is problematic, and I think I would want to steer clear of it. I think it tries to explain a series of different events and a series of different moments, and understanding where it perhaps doesn't apply, I think, is just as important as where it does. Chris, I think you had more.
Well, I think we are also in need of a kind of a fourth model, which explains pretty clearly the role of affect in moving from mobilization to organizing, which I think both Hillary and Anna were talking about. You know, there's a lot of work on various aspects of this. Well, there's Carolyn on habit. I mean, I take that to be the you know, one of the crucial stakes of your book. And, you know, I thought a lot about the real difficulty of getting academics to shift from opposition to particular things to habitual constitutivity of their working conditions. I mean, it's almost impossible to get us to do that. Get, you know, professional managerial types, you know, involved in that kind of work. One model for me that is important for a lot of people is the Black Civil Rights Movement in the US, which went through multiple modes from, you know, 1865 to 1965. So there's 100 years of organizing that were intermixed with the affective intensities of specific mobilizations, and now it's gone on for another 55 years after that because, you know, the unfinished nature of the work. So I mean, the question buried in this is, I guess for all of us, really, do we understand what the switching point for that is, where there's an affect that can be sustained, or affects that can transform themselves into sustainability in a way that goes beyond, say, Occupy or the particular interval moments.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question for all of us. So maybe others want to come in first. But so I mean, I would like I completely agree, and I guess in a way the book seeks to stop. So one of the critiques that Emilius Chrysolides had was of this the kind of, you know, that the book holds back from talking about the people and the nation, which is the kind of ontologically determined moment, and instead holds back in that kind of more formless crowd with its atmosphere, which is staying in a kind of potentiality. And I think the work of Jodie Dean was really important for me in that, because Dean talks about the crowd as this kind of misassembling moment, which then comes along, but then afterwards is the work of organization, where and that is the work of creating, of saying that the people was there. So the people is always created after the fact. It's identified after the fact, and in that kind of retroactive act. And that's the work of organization, and that's the work for Jodie Dean of the party, or a party. And I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, also just really quickly, like people like Deborah Gould, Carolyn's work as well, and Lara, like all of that series of questions about organization, around prefiguration, I think all of those are really, really important. And I think in some ways the book just stops just before that and tries not to get too far into that, because actually I think there's something about that state of unsettling and misassembling, which is in itself really important and worth sticking with before we get to the question of organization.
You know, there's a fourth question as well as a fourth model. But we promised a stopping point. Are you ready for one more? You three, can you do it? Okay, this is from Simon Thorpe. To link the discussion of exhaustion and organizing, perfectly timed this question. It was precisely the exhaustion of protest movements and crowded assemblies in Europe and North America in the wake of 2011 that led to the move away from protest and back to electoralism. It's very true. Syriza, left populism, municipalism, etc. So of course, these affective atmospheres of crowds not only change the nature of the crowd, but can eventually turn the crowd into something else entirely. Could we go so far as to say that the only successful crowd is one that exhausts itself, ceases to be a crowd, and becomes ... an organization, a people, a constituent process, a government, or whatever you would want the crowd to become? I say yes, but
yeah,
Ellen, what do you say?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like you know, that the kind of idea of a perpetual revolution is impossible, as we've seen. And so, you know, the crowd must exhaust itself at some point and hand itself over. So some of the work on Andean constitutionalism that I've done is about a constitution of turbulence, a constitution which tries to open itself out to a kind of perpetually being destabilized and challenged. And so, I mean, it fails in Bolivia in lots and lots of different ways. But I think it was a really interesting experiment of a government which seeks to kind of almost institute a social movement outside of itself, which it has no control over, which seeks to then undermine the government and have that kind of separation of powers beyond the state almost. So you know, I think there the idea is of the perpetual return of a crowd if and when the state becomes overburdening or recursive in its power, in the justification of its power, as they say. But I mean, obviously we know the history of Bolivia in the recent history that fails and the state tries to overcome the social movements, and then there's a coup, and then the crowds are back and the crowds guarantee that. And anyway, it's complicated. So it's too complicated for a 632. Yeah.
Lara and Carolyn, last words.
Thank you for a wonderful book and a wonderful event we got.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I also would agree with Simon's point at the end. I would just add that I think that a really important part of the way in which affect is taken up and sustains a movement is also in the relationships built out of protest that become really important in the process of organizing. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
That's good.
Yeah, thank you all. This was great. Thank you for the excellent questions. Thank you for the really valuable interventions. A really interesting conversation. We'll see you in Burnley in a month. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.